Bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum.
Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, I talk about choosing a tonal solfege or rhythm syllable system to use in MLT-based instruction. Hello and welcome to the Everyday Musicality podcast. Over the next few episodes, we're going to be digging deeper into the verbal association skill level of the skill learning sequence framework that is at the heart of MLT. I'll be talking about specific rhythmic and tonal skills learned at the verbal association skill level, and then I'll talk about bridging from verbal association to generalization and to the creativity improvisation skill level. Before getting into those topics, though, I wanted to spend some time today discussing different systems for tonal solfege and rhythm syllables, and why you might choose one syllable system over another. Remember how in the previous episode, I gave an introduction to the verbal association skill level and talked about how the general gist of the verbal association level is that students begin learning to associate tonal solfege or rhythm syllables to the familiar content they have already audiated and performed at the oral level on neutral syllables. And that at verbal association, students also learn to begin labeling different tonalities, meters, and pattern functions based on the tonal solfege or rhythm syllables they're learning to associate with those familiar sounds. Most MLT practitioners utilize a particular system of tonal solfege and a particular system of rhythm syllables, not because those are the quote-unquote best systems, but because those are the systems that make the most sense given the goals and sequencing that are at the core of MLT. Personally, I don't believe there is one universal right syllable system or best syllable system. It's more a matter of what your goal is for using the syllables and when in the learning process you're going to introduce the syllables. In MLT, our primary overall goal is developing audiation. Therefore, an MLT practitioner would want to choose a syllable system that facilitates audiation, and they especially wouldn't want to use a syllable system that conflicts with audiation. So that's priority number one, to choose a syllable system that is aligned with audiation. Also, one of the core tenets of MLT is that the music learning process parallels the process through which we learn our native language. Back in the first few episodes of this podcast, I talked about the core tenets of MLT, one of which is sequential learning. I talked about the core tenet of sequential learning back in episode 3. I'll link to that episode in the show notes, but in a nutshell, just as with language, we naturally learn music by first listening to, then imitating the sounds we hear, and then using the sounds to express our own thoughts, which in music we would call improvisation. Then later, we associate symbols to the sounds we've been hearing and making. So according to this process, introducing solfege and rhythm syllables at the verbal association level comes before associating symbols to those sounds in the form of music notation at the symbolic association level. Therefore, in choosing a syllable system to use with MLT-based instruction, it needs to be a system that can be used effectively before introducing music notation. So those are the two things to consider when you're deciding whether to use a particular syllable system in MLT-based instruction. Is the system aligned with audiation? And how effectively can the system be used before the introduction of music notation and music theory? So before we get into specific skills learned at the verbal association level in upcoming episodes, I thought it would be helpful to spend this episode giving a quick overview of the various syllable systems that exist, and I'll talk about their benefits and drawbacks in terms of the extent to which each system is aligned with audiation and how effectively it can be used before introducing music notation. First, let's look at tonal syllable systems. One commonly used system is numbers. In the number system, scale degree 1 is assigned the number 1, the second step of the scale is assigned the number 2, and so on. So in this system, we would have for major tonality 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 3, 5, 3, 1. One of the strengths of the number system in terms of audiation is that it's built around a tonal center. The resting tone is always 1. But therein lies an issue. The resting tone is always 1 no matter what the tonality is. So in major we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 3, 5, 3, 1. And in minor we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 3, 5, 3, 1. We've got the exact same numbers used to represent different sounds in different tonal contexts. So there's no way to differentiate between major and minor without talking about half steps and whole steps, which would not be appropriate at the verbal association level in MLT. Talking about half steps and whole steps would happen at the theoretical understanding level, which occurs much later in the learning process. A solution could be to use a different number as the resting tone in different tonalities, like using 6 as the resting tone in minor, but this wouldn't make much sense and would be pretty confusing, I think. Even with 1 as the first scale degree, this system can still be pretty confusing for kids because the numbers system uses ordinal numbers. This means the numbers have a set order, and you would need to be able to go backwards and skip around within that order of numbers, and that has a lot more to do with mathematical intelligence than music aptitude. Furthermore, the number system doesn't have alterations for non-scale pitches or chromaticism, so altered pitches would still use the same number as unaltered pitches, further necessitating discussion of half and whole steps. So if your goal is audiation, and you want to be able to use solfege effectively before introducing notation and music theory, the number system is not the most fitting option. Another tonal solfege system is fixed do, or immovable do. In the fixed do system, C is always do no matter what. It doesn't matter if the music you're working with is in C major or G major or F minor, do is always C. So if we were singing in C major, we would have do, re, mi, fa, sol, fa, mi, re, do, mi, so, mi, do. But if we were singing in D major, we would have re, mi, fi, sol, la, so, fi, mi, re, fi, la, fi, re. Okay, I'll admit, I totally just wrote out the solfege syllables so that I'd be able to sing them in fixed do. For MLT-based instruction, the first issue with the fixed do system is that it is completely out of alignment with audiation. We audiate contextually, so we would want to use a tonal solfege system that reflects tonality. In the fixed do system, the resting tone syllable would change with key or keyality, even if the music stays in the same tonality. So music in the keyality of C would use the resting tone do, but music in the keyality of D would use the resting tone re. But since tonal audiation is based on context, we actually audiate the pitch relationships within major tonality pretty consistently regardless of keyality, regardless of which absolute pitch is acting as the tonic. Another issue with fixed do is that it's rooted in music notation and theory. How do you know what pitch is do? You look at it on the staff. Apart from notation, it's hard to make sense of fixed do because it doesn't reflect tonal context. Gordon said on page 38 of the book, Taking a Reasonable and Honest Look at Tonal Solfege and Rhythm Solfege, quote, "Realistically, the immovable do system cannot be used to teach students how to read music notation through audiation, because students must read music notation in order to understand the system," end quote. So if we were teaching with an approach where students would start with notation right away from day one, and you didn't care about audiation, then fixed do might make more sense. But for MLT-based instruction, fixed do is not ideal because it's rooted in notation, and so it's difficult to use before introducing notation, and it doesn't align with audiation of tonal context. Again, this is not to say that fixed do is a universally bad or wrong system, just that it doesn't work well in MLT-based instruction because, again, our main goal is audiation, and we facilitate audiation and skill development in a sequential way that involves introducing solfege before introducing notation. Another tonal solfege system is movable do with a do-based minor. So this system is more fitting with MLT-based instruction than fixed Do because changing the keyality, changing the absolute pitch that's functioning as the tonic or the first scale degree, that doesn't change the resting tone syllable in movable Do with Do bass minor. So now, if we're singing in C major, we have Sol, La, Sol, Fa, Mi, Re, Ti, Do. And if we're singing in D major, we have Sol, La, Sol, Fa, Mi, Re, Ti, Do. So that's an improvement in terms of alignment with audiation. However, in movable Do with a Do bass minor, we would have in minor Sol, La, Sol, Fa, Mi, Re, Ti, Do. And in Dorian, we would have Sol, La, Sol, Fa, Mi, Re, Te, Do. We have to use chromatic alterations when singing in every tonality other than major. In order to do this, it necessitates some discussion of half steps and whole steps. This is problematic in MLT-based instruction, again, because we're introducing solfege at verbal association before students learn music notation or theory at later levels. Gordon said on page 35 of the book I mentioned before, Taking a Reasonable and Honest Look at Tonal Solfege and Rhythm Solfege, quote, "Consider the number of chromatic alterations necessary to perform patterns using a Do-based Phrygian or a Do-based Locrian. To be even mildly successful doing so, contemplation of theoretical strategies is enormous." End quote. So it would be inappropriate to explain chromatic alterations by talking about notation or theory at the verbal association level, because that goes against MLT's core tenet of sequential learning. Also, going back to audiation, in the movable Do with Do bass minor system, every tonality uses Do as the resting tone, which means that the syllable used for the resting tone doesn't uniquely reflect the tonality being heard and audiated. Finally, we have movable Do with a La bass minor, and a Re-based Dorian, a Mi-based Phrygian, and so on. In the movable Do with La bass minor system, we have Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, Fa, Mi, Re, Do, Mi, So, Mi, Do for major, and we have La, Ti, Do, Re, Mi, Re, Do, Ti, La, Do, Mi, Do, La for minor. In this system, the solfege syllable used for the resting tone is unique for each tonality. This is a terrific advantage in terms of audiation because once students start to learn to sing resting tone and patterns with solfege and to label tonality at the verbal association skill level, the solfege syllables can be used as a tool for discriminating between different tonalities at the partial synthesis level and for identifying tonalities at the generalization level. For example, we might be singing a song like ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, bum-ba-dum-ba-da-dum, ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, bum-ba-dum-ba-da-dum. I'm audiating Do, Mi, So as the tonic, so that song must be in major tonality. Or we might hear ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, ba-dum-ba-da-dum, ya-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum, bum-ba-dum-ba-da-dum. I'm audiating La, Do, Mi as the tonic pattern, so that song must be in minor tonality. So with movable Do with a La bass minor, we have a unique solfege syllable for the resting tone and thus for the tonic pattern in every tonality. So it becomes a great tool for differentiating among the various tonalities. Because once you're totally immersed in the solfege in each tonality, it really strengthens your audiation in each tonality. For example, Mi, Fa, Mi, Re, Do, Ti, Si, La. La, Do, Mi, Do, La. La, Re, Fa, Re, La. Si, Re, Mi, Re, Si. Mi, Do, La. Or La, Ti, La, So, Fa, Mi, Do, Re. Re, Fa, La, Fa, Re. Re, So, Ti, So, Re. Do, Mi, So, Mi, Do. La, Fa, Re. Singing in La-based minor, Re-based Dorian, and so on helps you audiate in each unique tonality, and you don't need to talk about music theory with your students to teach them movable Do with La-based minor. As Gordon stated on pages 35 and 36 in the book I mentioned earlier, quote, "In the movable do system with a la bass minor, audiation of the resting tone as it relates contextually to series of tonal patterns is all that is necessary to be aware of any tonality. Knowledge of chromatic syllables, half and whole steps, music theory, and notation is unnecessary." So this is why virtually all practitioners who utilize MLT choose to use movable do with a la bass minor as their tonal solfege system. Because it doesn't require music notation or theory to be used effectively with students and thus fits with the sequential process of the scale learning sequence, and because it aligns with tonal audiation. Next, let's look at rhythm syllable systems. And again, I want to stress that this isn't about any system being right or wrong. It's about what your ultimate goal is and when in the process you're introducing syllables versus notation and theory. Again, in MLT, our ultimate goal is audiation development, and we introduce syllables at the verbal association level before introducing notation and music theory at later levels. So we want to choose a rhythm syllable system that aligns with how we audiate rhythmically and one that will make sense before the introduction of notation or music theory. One commonly used system for rhythm syllables is the 1E system. This is very common here in the United States, especially in instrumental music programs. I remember learning the 1E system back when I was in band in school. If you're not familiar with this system, it's based on counting beats according to where they lie within the measure. So, for example, if you're reading music in 4/4, you might read 1E and a 2 and 3E and a 4. Essentially, we have numbers on the macro beats and then and for the microbeats. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So in a sense, this somewhat aligns with audiation because it has different syllables for the macro beats versus the microbeats in between. However, the bigger issue is that counting is based on where each beat falls within the measure, so it's used in conjunction with music notation. This is how we determine exactly which number we're using when. For example, if you're looking at a measure of all eighth notes in 4/4, you would count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. But if you were looking at the exact same number of eighth notes in 2/4, you would count 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and. Another issue with this system is that sometimes the numbers refer to macro beats and sometimes the numbers refer to micro beats. In the example I just gave, the numbers were macro beats, and the ands were the microbeats in between. But if we were reading in 6/8, we might read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 4, 5, 6, 1, 4. In this instance, the numbers were microbeats, and the ands would be divisions of the microbeats. So in these situations, the counting doesn't align with audiation because it doesn't reflect beat function consistently. It doesn't consistently reflect the relationship between macrobeats and microbeats. The 1E system is primarily focused on note values and where they fall within a measure. So the inherent meaning in this system is rooted in notation rather than audiation. Therefore, it's not the most effective system if your goal is audiation and you want to introduce syllables before notation and theory, like we do in MLT. Another commonly used rhythm syllable system, particularly with younger students, is mnemonics, where various words are used to represent different rhythmic figures. With mnemonics, the words used to represent the different rhythmic figures are typically focused around a theme. For example, a common one is fruit names. So in this example, a quarter note might be pear, 2 eighth notes might be apple, and 4 16th notes might be watermelon. Pear, pear, apple, pear, watermelon, apple, watermelon, pear. Now these can be fun, and I'm not saying you should never use mnemonics in your classroom, but I don't believe it's the most effective system for supporting audiation development and sequential learning in MLT. First, mnemonics are used in tandem with notation. The point in the mnemonic system is to apply each word to each of the various rhythmic figures seen in notation. And that's not in alignment with the sequencing of MLT, where we introduce syllables before music notation. Also, mnemonics don't support audiation because they don't reflect how we audiate rhythmically. They don't foster audiation of meter or a sense of rhythmic context. The sounds we speak in mnemonics don't reflect beat levels or beat functions, they represent notational figures. Furthermore, there isn't internal logic to the system, so certain words could potentially be interpreted as different rhythmic figures. For example, you might use strawberry as a set of triplets, strawberry, strawberry. But strawberry could also possibly be strawberry, strawberry. So because there isn't internal logic to the system, mnemonics aren't as solid a tool for differentiating between different meters and rhythmic figures clearly. Again, this is not to say that mnemonics is bad or wrong or that you should never use mnemonics, but if we want a system that supports audiation development and can be used effectively before introducing music notation, then mnemonics isn't the most effective system to use in MLT-based instruction. Another rhythm syllable system is the one commonly used in Kodai-based instruction, which is based on time values of notes. In this system, the syllable you say is based on the time value of the note that you see. So if you see a quarter note, you say ta. If you see a pair of eighth notes, you say ti, and so on. Because the syllable that you say is based on the time value of the note that you see, this tells you right off the bat that this system isn't the best fit for MLT-based instruction because it doesn't make sense if you're not looking at notation. Again, if you were teaching with an approach where you're starting with notation right away when you're using syllables, then the system might be okay. But in MLT, we want students to become fluent in syllables as a tool for continuing to develop audiation and for discriminating between meters and functions before learning to associate notation with the sounds. So for that reason, we need a system that makes sense away from notation, that derives its internal logic based on how rhythm is audiated. And that brings us to a second issue with this system, and that's the fact that it doesn't reflect rhythmic audiation. Because it's based on note values, sometimes we would be saying ta on a macro beat if it's a quarter note, ta, 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 ta. But sometimes we would be saying ti on a macro beat if it's a pair of eighth notes, ti, 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 ti. So there isn't a consistent syllable that always aligns with the macro beat. Also, to my knowledge, this system only makes limited use of syllables in triple meter, and those it does use have the same limitation of being based on time values of notes. Again, this is not to say that Kodai syllables are a universally bad or wrong system, but if you want a system that's aligned with audiation and can be used before introducing music notation, it's not a great fit. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you can always alter a system to make it fit your needs or goals for your students. I've heard there are some Kodai instructors who are using ta-ti for paired eighth notes. So instead of ta-ti-ti-ti-ti-ta, they would say ta-ta-ti-ta-ti-ta, which does apply different syllables for macrobeats versus microbeats. For use in MLT-based instruction, there would likely be other things you might want to change to make the system fit with the goals and sequencing of MLT. But that's just an example of how you could tweak a syllable system to fit your needs and goals. The alteration I just mentioned is very similar to the next syllable system, which is the French time names system. In this system, macrobeats are always chanted as ta, and microbeats in duple meter would be ta-te. So we might have ta, ta-te, ta-te, ta. So a positive of the system is that there are different syllables for macrobeats and microbeats in duple meter if we're audiating a quarter note as the macrobeat. One downside is that while the system does have syllables for triple meter, some of the same syllables are used as microbeats in duple and in triple. In duple we have ta-te, 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 ta-te. And in triple we have ta-te-ti, ta-te-ti, ta-te-ti. Because both meters use the syllable te to represent a microbeat, the syllables don't reflect the differences between duple and triple particularly effectively. We could even have the exact same syllables performed with different rhythm in each meter. For example, in duple, ta-te-ta, ta-te-ta, versus in triple, ta-te-ta, ta-te-ta. Even though the first was in duple and the second was in triple, the syllables were the same. So it's not as clear a tool for differentiating between meters if we have the exact same syllables representing different sounds in each meter. Finally, the system uses different syllables for music written in 3/4 versus 6/8. In MLT, we would call those two enrhythmic, when different symbols can be used to represent the same sounds. For example, we could notate the rhythm do-da-dee-do as 3/8 notes in a dotted quarter in 6/8, or as 3/4 notes in a dotted half note in 3/4. So it's essentially changing which note values you're using to represent the macro and micro beats for any rhythm pattern. Just like we can have the same absolute pitch notated in different ways, say F sharp and G flat, and we call that enharmonic, the term enrhythmic means we can have different ways of notating the same rhythmic sounds. So in MLT-based instruction, we want a system that is consistent with enrhythmic measure signatures and enrhythmic patterns because we want the syllables to be based on how we audiate rhythmically, not on note values. Because the French time name system uses different syllables for meters that are considered enrhythmic, it's not the best fit for MLT-based instruction. Finally, this brings us to the syllable system based on beat function. The beat function-based syllables are often called Gordon syllables. However, James Froseth was one of Gordon's doctoral students in the 60s when he was at the University of Iowa, and he did a lot of work in shaping the syllables based on what Gordon had been using in the 60s and 70s. And so Froseth did a lot of work of shaping those syllables into what we know of as the beat function-based syllables today. So you might hear them called Froseth syllables as well. Side note, if you're interested in learning more about the history of how MLT developed, Ronald Gerhardstein completed his dissertation at Temple University in 2001 based on a lot of historical research and personal communications with Gordon. It's called Edwin E. Gordon, a biographical and historical account of an American music educator and researcher. I'll see if I can upload a PDF of that to my website. If I can, I'll link to that in the show notes. Also, side note, I'm not sure if he pronounces his last name Gerhardstein or Gerhardstein, so my apologies if it's incorrect. It's super interesting, though, reading about how all the different aspects of MLT we know today came to be developed and the rich history of people that have played a role in the evolution of MLT. You can also read Gordon's autobiography called Discovering Music from the Inside Out, which is available through podcast sponsor GIA Publications. I heard a rumor that Gordon actually wrote that autobiography because he wasn't entirely happy about how some things were portrayed in Gerhardstein's dissertation. So there's a little Gimmel drama for you. Anyway, back to the beat function-based syllables. In this system, the macrobeat is always chanted on the syllable do, no matter what meter you're in, and then there are different microbeat syllables for duple versus triple meter. So in duple meter, we have do, do-day, do. And in triple meter, we have do, do-da-dee, do-da-dee, do. This is really important because there's internal logic to the beat function-based system that reflects how we audiate music rhythmically. Move with me for a minute. Let's sway our bodies to the macro beat. Do, 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 do. Now add the microbeats in your hands. Do-day, 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 do-day. You don't need to see any notation to use those syllables because they're based on how you're feeling rhythm in the body. Now try this. Keep swaying to the macro beat. Do, do, do. Now add these micro beats in your hands. Do-da-dee, 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 do-da-dee. Again, you didn't need notation to use the syllables because they're based on how we feel triple meter in the body. And there are unique microbeat syllables for duple meter versus triple meter, so the syllables can be used as a tool to orally discriminate between meters before we ever read a note of music notation. They're based on how we feel the different beat levels, macrobeat and microbeat, and then we can add divisions in between. We can add tas. Move with me again to the macro beats. Do, do, do. Now add these microbeats in your hands. Do-day, 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 do-day. Keep that movement going and let's add divisions. Do-ta-data, 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 do. So the great thing about these syllables, again, not to say they're the best syllables or the right syllables, but the thing that makes them work really well in MLT-based instruction is that they reflect how we audiate music rhythmically, how we audiate meter, and they can be used easily before the introduction of music notation because they're based on how we audiate, not on what we see in notation. This is why most MLT practitioners use the beat function-based rhythm syllable system, because it fosters audiation and because it makes sense and can be used effectively before students learn notation. The beat function syllable system also has particular syllables for uneven meters as well. Back in episode 7, which was called Menu of Meters, I went through all those various meters and modeled syllables with the beat function-based system in each meter. I'll link to that in the show notes in case you want to take a listen. I should also mention the more recently developed Takadimi system. The Takadimi system is also based on beat function. The macrobeat is always ta, and then this is divided into different syllables for the microbeats. So in duple meter, for example, instead of do, day, do, we have ta-dee, ta, ta-dee, ta. And this is not tied to note value, but rather to beat and how it is divided. So it can be used consistently across n rhythmic measure signatures. The Takadimi system also uses different syllables for the microbeats in duple versus triple meters. In duple, we have ta-dee, 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 ta. And in triple, we have takida, 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 ta. Gordon himself even commended the Takadimi system in his Taking a Reasonable and Honest Look at Tonal Solfege and Rhythm Solfege book. On page 73, he wrote, quote, "It has 3 commendable features. It is based on beat functions, it posits different syllables for duple and triple meters, and it supports the concept of enrhythmic measure signatures." From there, however, what's claimed to be a benefit of the Takadimi system is also something that can make it a bit more confusing, in my opinion, and that's that the different syllables used for divisions of microbeats. In duple, we have ta-dee, takadimi, takadimi, ta. And in triple, we have takida, tavakidi-dama, tavakidi-dama, ta. Yes, I wrote out those syllables again. So in this system, every division of a microbeat has a unique syllable. In between the microbeats ta-dee, in duple, we have 2 different division syllables, ka and mi. Takadimi, 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 based on where they're happening in the rhythmic figure. Takadimi, takadimi, ta, dimi, takadi, takadi. In triple, in between the microbeats takida, takida, we have 3 different division syllables, va, di, and ma, depending on where they're happening within the rhythmic figure. Tavakidi dama, ta, ki, dama, ta, kidi, da. The system touts these different division syllables as a benefit of the system, but personally, I don't see that the value added is worth the added confusion. It could just be that I'm not familiar enough with the syllables and haven't used them with students, so maybe I haven't experienced the full benefits. But personally, I never found it problematic to have all divisions of microbeats have the syllable ta when using the beat function-based syllables with students. Gordon wrote in the Taking a Reasonable and Honest Look at Tonal Solfege and Rhythm Solfege book on pages 73 and 74 that it's not clear why having different syllables for divisions is worth the confusion because, quote, "In audiation, divisions do not, of course, signify trenchant beat functions," end quote. In other words, that divisions of microbeats are not in themselves powerful enough influences on the way that we audiate rhythm to warrant giving every division its own unique syllable. Well, I hope this overview of the various tonal and rhythm solfege syllable systems has been helpful in explaining why many MLT practitioners use the movable do with la-based minor and beat function-based syllable systems. Not to say that those are the best systems or the right systems, but that those are the systems that make the most sense given the goals and sequencing of MLT. Because again, they reflect how we audiate music tonally and rhythmically, and because they don't require knowledge of notation or music theory. This means they facilitate the fundamental goal of supporting audiation development, and they can be used effectively at the verbal association skill level before introducing notation and theory at later levels of the skill learning sequence. Next, we'll be getting into how we actually start teaching with those syllable systems at the verbal association skill level in the coming episodes. If the topic of various syllable systems is interesting to you, or you want to read more of Gordon's ideas about the system directly from him, you might check out his book I've quoted several times in this episode called Taking a Reasonable and Honest Look at Tonal Solfege and Rhythm Solfege. It's published by podcast sponsor GIA Publications, so I'll link to that in the show notes as well. Speaking of podcast sponsors, I wanted to mention that our other podcast sponsor, the Gordon Institute for Music Learning, is hosting a faculty hangout on Saturday, March 19th at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will be the faculty member on call that day. Unlike formal presentations or workshops, the faculty hangouts are meant to be an informal chance for people to come and ask faculty members questions, get advice, chat about something they're curious about, and just generally pick the faculty member's brain. Folks are also welcome to just lurk and listen in on the conversation as well. The focus for my faculty hangout on March 19th is advertised as Q&A about all things elementary general because I'm an elementary general faculty member, but I'm happy to chat about anything at all related to MLT, music education research, you name it. So if there's anything I've ever talked about on this podcast where you've thought, I'd love to know more about that, come to the Faculty Hangout and ask and ye shall receive. I'll link to the GIML website in the show notes for more info and the registration link. These Faculty Hangouts are free for GIML members, and it's not too late to join if you've been considering it and would like to be able to attend the March 19th Hangout with me. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day.